you so much. Thank you and hello everyone. I always like to know who I'm talking to in the audience. So if you are an adopted person or a foster person, okay, adoptive or foster parents, and professional at doing work in adoption. I guess I am too. Oh, a lot of us, okay. Multiple identities, I like it. Just someone who has adoption in their life or foster care in their life. Great. Welcome, welcome. So my name is Hollee McGinnis, and Pat invited me to come and share, and I'll be more excited. Hopefully I'll be invited again next year when I have actual data. So we are in the middle of collecting data. Actually, y'all are getting a special link if you are an adopted person to do the survey, because I've actually closed the public survey. But we are actively collecting data on this research project called Mapping the Life Course of Adoption, Health, Well-Being, and Adopted Connections in Adulthood. So this happens to all the presenters. I think I'm not the person for that, so I'm that rich. I'm going to just see if that works.
How would it the link to the site?
I have a QR code.
If I can just ask you to speak up a little more too, because there are sometimes issues with the audio virtually. Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you so much.
I usually have a loud voice because I grew up in New York. I also talk fast, but I'll try to keep. If I start to get soft, please just put your thumbs up. So I'm going to discuss the project and really just walk you through some of the logic from my own personal experience as to how I got to wanting to do this particular study. And hopefully some of that walkthrough will include a brief history around adult adoptee groups and spaces, as well as what we know around adult outcomes. So this was a project that is a community-based participatory research project. Almost all of my research partners are also adopted people, and my community partners, because I'm very connected into the Korean adoptee community specifically, have been largely Korean adoptee groups, but it's expanding out after this. And I got funding from my university for this project. So background and rationale for a study that's looking at adoptee-led groups and adult outcomes. Why? Well, guess what? I'm an adopted person. And this is me in 1974 in my orphanage and on Tokchuk Island. So many of you might know of Incheon, all right? And Incheon Airport is actually two islands that they merged together to make that whole airport. And my island, Tokchuk, is one of the many islands that are in that bay, that area. And roughly, I think this picture is when maybe 1974, and then this is me and my adoptive family. So I was adopted at the age of 3, came to the McGinnis family at the John F. Kennedy Airport. I had an older brother and sister, both biological to my parents. I did not really grow up thinking much about being adopted. I think part of it was because I had older siblings and they were like, oh, another McGinnis is coming through the coming through school. And so there wasn't a lot of explanation that I felt that I had to do about being adopted. And if it did come up, it was almost like breathing. So it was like if somebody asked a question, then I would think about it. But otherwise, it was always more in the background. I was 100% Irish Catholic. Hollee McGinnis. Went to even a Catholic high school, and my one moment of awakening though happened my senior year of high school. Somehow me and my 7 friends, all who were white, in the same Catholic high school, convinced our parents to let us go to Disney World by ourselves. Wow. Yeah, we worked. Our parents were like,
What's a white family?
Oh yeah. They're manipulative. So we'd be like, oh, mom, Patty's mom let her go. So we worked them all, and we went to Epcot. So this is the first time that I'm traveling with my peers, without my parents, protective bubble, and I go to China, and the people start speaking to me in Chinese. I'm like, okay. I go to buy something in Japan in Epcot. They're telling me the price in Japanese, and I'm like, I don't know. So then I'm looking at my friends who are of Irish descent and German descent. I'm like, why isn't anybody talking to you in Celtic or German? Like, why am I being spoken to, but you are not? And so that question laid a foundation. When I went to college, I said, well, my God, everyone is expecting me to know how to speak Chinese and Japanese that I don't. I know I came from Korea. And at that time, 1990, I'm in college, undergraduate, they didn't have Korean classes. So I was like, well, I'm going to learn Mandarin because that must be like the Latin of all Asian languages. It's not. It's a really hard language, okay? But that was my default. But then my sophomore year, I said, hold on a second. If I do know how to speak all of these languages, I'm just fulfilling a racial stereotype. If you look like me, that's what you're going to know. And I said, I got to figure out, how am I an American with this Irish last name, a blonde hair mom, and my Korean face? So I changed my major to American Studies because I wanted to understand how I fit. So I largely focused on 20th century American race history, which was largely African race history, really. And I read a really formative book. It was called, I can't remember the book, but it was about mixed race African American white. And it just opened up my brain because I realized the social construction of race and that I was not feeling like I could fit anywhere because my life didn't fit into the binary. I could never be white like my parents because I racially don't look that way. Even though culturally I know that's exactly how I've been raised. I could not fit into the Korean Student Association groups or the Asian Student Association groups because even though I looked like them, I didn't have the same connections and relationships. I did not grow up eating kimchi rice. But when I realized that there could be a third identity, just as mixed race people, especially in the Deep South, that was like a whole third class. I was like, oh, I could be that identity between identities. And that laid the foundation. 2 years after college, I was 24, living in New York City, trying to figure out what to do with my life. I thought I wanted to help people. So I took all my medical school exams and even took the MCATs. And then I was like, why didn't I figure out that I didn't want to go to middle school before taking the MCATs? But I did. But, you know, then I didn't know what to do because I was like, well, if I can't help people, you know, as a doctor, what am I going to do? So I got a job in a publishing company and that sustained me. But through that work, a friend of mine suggested I do this leadership training program. And so I did. And part of the leadership training program was to create a project in one of your communities. So I had done an undergraduate, as an undergraduate my senior year, I did a thesis looking at racial ethnic identity of 8 women who were adopted from South Korea. That's who I was studying. Well, I've been asking those same questions now, 27 years later. But having that aha, that I could have an identity between identities, became the foundation of Also Known As. And so in that time, I was reading lots of news stories about all of the children that were being adopted from China. And I said, okay, I know there's over 200,000 Korean adoptees alone who are in the United States, but I haven't met many of them. I didn't grow up having much contact at all. I didn't go to a culture camp or anything like that because I grew up in the 70s and there wasn't really that much of that going on yet. So I said, well, what if my generation could become mentors to that younger generation of families? Because I said, wow, it would have been really helpful for me if I had had some families that look like my own. And so Also Known As was born with the specific purpose of serving that younger generation. But really, we ended up serving ourselves. And through Also Known As, which is going strong still, I specifically did not want it to be an association of Korean adoptees. Because I said, we are more than just that. I really was committed about creating a space where adopted people could claim their identity. Because we had so many identities being imposed on us and expected of us, that I wanted to create a space where adoptees could claim their own selves. I wasn't unique, So a little history now about Korean adoptee groups and formation. So Korean adoptees in Europe had started to organize even earlier than also known as 1996 in the late 80s and 1990s. And those were some of the first groups. And then in the US, the first group was the Association of Korean Adoptees, Southern California, 1994, also known as AAAW, and in 1990, Boston Korean Adoptees. And now there's just a plethora. You go on the internet, you look at Korean adoptees, and you're going to find some sort of connection, or in Philadelphia. I mean, they're everywhere. But let me remind you, for those who can remember, what it was in 1996 to get onto the internet. You had to go through AOL. You had to dial. Right? So I also want to do a shout out that this is AAPI month. So yay to Asian Pacific Islander, right? But I was like, how am I going to find these adoptees back in 1996 who are going to become my mentor, or going to become my mentors? How am I going to find the kids? And so I remember going to an AAPI, it was out in front of Lincoln Center. And so it was a big festival. And just going from booth to booth to booth, saying, hi, I'm Hollee McGinnis. I'm looking for adoptees. Everybody was adopted. And I was like, I could never have imagined that I was doing that when I was a young child, because it wasn't a thing. And it still didn't feel like a thing, but I definitely wanted to connect to that younger generation. Adoptee groups and associations also began to formulate in South Korea. So that's been a very unique part of the formulation of the Korean adoptee community. Some of these are, ASK, for example, has now disbanded, but that was really, I think, a unique piece of our history. Another unique piece of the Korean adoptee community specifically is the fact that we had a gathering in 1999 of the first generation of Korean adoptees in Washington, D.C. And that was a real shift from saying, okay, we're all these individual groups, to we are a community. Look at all of us standing here. There was about 500 of us that all came together. We could feel the community, right? 500 adoptees all in a conference room. And this has been written about that early time in a couple of books, but that gathering ended up spawning many other gatherings, and there's actually a gathering now. I think this is the 8th one in South Korea this summer. So we have been gathering all around the country and all around the world at these, usually hotels and that kind of stuff, generating, connecting, and staying connected before the internet got really big, and then maintaining it as well. So Korean adoptee groups, also known as, had one of the first websites. It's not AKA World anymore. It's also known as .org. But Sunny Jo was a European adoptee, and she had one of the first and extensive adoptee worldwide groups, bloggers, so adoptees have been connecting on the internet as well. But I just want to touch back and remind everyone that adoptees have been organizing much earlier than just the Korean adoptee groups. That in the 1970s, along with the rise of lots of rights movements of a lot of historically oppressed groups, adoptees had also began to elevate their issues too, especially the domestic adoptees. And then international adoptees have also infiltrated and influenced ideas around motherland tours, around culture camps, and even working in an adoption agency. So I just want to say we've been around, but I don't think we've always thought of ourselves as a community or as a force. So these are some of the research that's been done on the Korean adoptee groups. And again, this is really largely focusing on the 1990s, early 2000s. Very little has been written about them later on, and they're largely like this is really around identity, and this is more about the social political relationship between adoptees in the U.S. as well as in South Korea. So it's a more political analysis, So I knew about this history, obviously, because I lived it. I was a very active member and organizer in the community. But I ended up shifting my focus a little bit. So I had always felt that adoptees were an asset, was a resource to child welfare practice. So when I decided to get my MSW, my last year, I was like, oh, let me try this hand at writing. So I wrote this piece for the Columbia University Social Review, which was the student journal, about adult adoptees as being a resource for practice. We had wisdom, we had an experience to share. But I remember back then, there was a lot of reluctance of adoption agencies and even adoptive parents who were kind of wary about, what are you going to tell our kids? Are you an angry adoptee? And so I had to penetrate a lot of that presumption. But I was saying, but I want to get to the kids. I want to help them. I want them to know they're not alone. And then I worked at the Donaldson Adoption Institute, and this has also been a key part of my thinking. So I led a study while I was there called Beyond Culture Camp, again, looking at a national study of adopted adults, asking them what was their adoptive identity, racial, ethnic identity, and what helped them formulate those identities. So this was one piece of finding that I love to share from that study, Beyond Culture Camp. So we just asked a simple question. How important was your identity as an adopted person at these different life stages? So it was a reflective one. And what we found was interesting. So largely the sample ended up being Korean transracial adoptees and white same-race adoptees. And what we found was that, you know, by preschool, people are thinking about it. So don't think that your little people are not thinking about their adoption, okay? But not the majority. By middle school, we have 50%, you know, 55% saying, okay, my adoptive identity became really important to me by middle school. But what is so interesting is that the importance of one's adoptive identity continues to go up as you age. And I think of Dr. Patton's, you know, comments at the keynote. This is what we saw. This was a pattern. Now, here I was fascinated because we didn't have that many people in the late adulthood. We only had 1 or 10. And so I said, oh, what's going on there too? But even in middle adulthood, we had a kind of good numbers. Adoption and identity continued to be important. And we had to sit and say, why? We made some surmise, but I wanted to get back to that. We also asked adoptees what was helpful for them in terms of their identity. And here I was intrigued. Events by adult adoptees with adult or adult adoptee organizations or support groups for adoptees. 60%, a little more than 60% for the Korean adoptees, about 47, almost 50% for the white adoptees. Now, remember the Korean adoptees have been organizing for about 20 years by this time. And I highlight the yellow because these are often things that are happening, at least within the international adoptee groups. We're eating a lot of food. We are trying to reconnect to our birth languages. And so all of those activities, while they you know, might be being done independently, they're often done as events within these adoptee groups and spaces. So those are my inklings that adoptee groups, or at least adoptee connections, matter. I ended up doing this presentation for the Rudd Adoption Research Center. They have a biannual conference. It's excellent. Back in, I think, 2016. And I ended up writing this paper talking about how adoptee scholarship is shifting as more and more adoptees are getting their PhDs and are entering in and asking different questions than the scholars who are either not connected to adoption or have been adoptive parents. Adoptive parents just wanted to know if their kids were adjusted. The adult adoptees are saying, how is the rest of my life looking? So we are asking and we're interested in very different things. I ended up running the 2020 to 2021 conference, which ended up being all virtual. So you can actually go here. All of the sessions are up there. But Dr. Hal Grodevan invited me to coordinate and to this research, this as the main theme, because he also recognized that we don't know much about adoption in later on in life. We don't know how those early patterns that we see, you know, in childhood. We know a little bit about adolescence and a little bit in early adulthood, but beyond that, we haven't really studied it at all. So I had to verify. So I went to the research letter and I said, okay, I'm going to do a gap map of the literature. These are the studies that these are the outcomes that I would imagine that we would have studied, given all of the research literature on adopted children. What you see, and it's kind of hard to see in here, is that where there's circles is where there's data, where there's papers that have been published. Where there's nothing, there is nothing. So I was interested in, are there any interventions that have been designed for adopted adults? There's nothing. There's nothing in those rows at all for anything. There's a little bit that's starting to percolate, but look at this. There's no research on grief and loss later on. There is no research looking at adoption disruptions later on. These are gaps. There's no research on trauma later on in life. These are the huge gaps. And part of it is because who funds this research? People want to fund little children, but they don't want to fund the research about how those little children end up later on in their life. So January 2020, 3 months before COVID pandemic kind of crushed all of our lives, I was diagnosed with breast cancer at 47. And that caused me to really have a hard pause. I had started working at UCU in 2017. I was supposed to be submitting my interim review for tenure that January. But instead I had this journey to go through. And I had known about ACEs because I studied it in my doctoral program. And I said, once I had all of the genetic testing and I wasn't BRCA positive, I had to say why. Everyone wants to know why they got cancer, right? And so I had to go to this. And in that same window of about 5-8 years, I had a close group, about 6 girlfriends who were also adopted from Korea, and half of us were diagnosed with breast cancer in our 40s. And so I wanted to know, is this a bigger trend? And I went to the research, of course, and I found a paper that compared from like national data rates, so age of onset for breast cancer of women in Asia, Asian American women, and white women. And what was my big takeaway was that age of onset is earlier for Asian women in Asia in their 30s. For Asian American women, it's in their 40s, and for white women, it's in your 60s. And why this matters is because the earlier you get cancer, the more quicker it grows, so the more lethal it becomes. And I realized that international adoptees disconnected from their ethnic group. Well, there was no way for us to know that. So I called some of my friends who are Korean natives and like, oh yeah, I get my mammography at the age of 30. And most of us is recommended at 40, right? That might be too late. Again, we don't know. We don't know. We don't have the data though to see how much that's impacting the adoptee community at all. And we know that any adoptee, most adoptees don't have access to their family medical history either. So I wanted to know then, okay, so if I really wanted to understand then, what are the ACEs? We don't know much of the trauma history in the research literature of adoptees because a lot of the trauma is presumed to have happened before the adoption, but many of the studies don't actually include any measures of any trauma post-adoption. So I figured if I want to understand what our physical health is, our mental health, our identity, I'm gonna have to recruit largely from adopted groups. So I want to also understand how the adoptee group and connections might be influencing. And I know from my own personal experience and research literature on why community happens, communities where we can explore, where we can gain new knowledge of things that we might not know at all. It's a place where we can belong. It's really hard to get that sense of belonging all by yourself. Community gives that to you. And I think the most critical thing that community is important is for power or empowerment and change. And again, you can make those internal changes, you can make those personal, individual power, but when you become part of a collective, it becomes that much stronger and profound. So what is the Mapping the Life Course of Adoption project? So I was really clear, and I want to make sure that I was trained in a very positivist, post-positivist model of research knowledge. And that is basically the model of researcher as expert, drops into a community, extracts the data that they want to know, goes back in, analyzes it in statistical language that nobody understands, publishes it in a journal that's locked behind a paywall. And no one in the community knows what the heck happened to their information. And I was really clear that if I do any work with adoptees, that's not how I'm going to do it. So there's all these other models of largely, spearheaded by indigenous scholars to decolonize research methods. And the key part of decolonizing methodologies is saying, this is our knowledge. It's not just yours. And so the, research is only as good as the questions you ask at the beginning and the interpretations you make at the end. And so that's why I had recruited and really worked closely with my Korean adoptee groups and organizations to develop what are the questions that we need to know. And I'm hoping that I'm really trying to develop a model for this for adoption research. So it's very experimental, it's very emergent. I'm like, I don't know what I'm doing. This feels kind of right, but there are models for it. So it's adoptee-led and community engaged. And so the part of the community engagement has been, I want people to know that I'm accessible. I'm not behind some academic ivory tower. I held a number of tea times to inform people about what the project was, especially for adoptees, why I was asking the questions that I was asking, and that I'm really committed to continue to hold those sessions because, Zoom is great. Everyone can get access wherever you are now. It's accessible. I'm accessible, right? Is really thinking and designing. The data is going to be the data. I will do the statistics. I'll try to interpret it for you, But in every research paper, there's a discussion section. And guess what? Discussion sessions are interpretations. They are meaning-making times with the data. And so I want to take some of the findings and host a webinar and say, what do you all meaning of this as adoptees? What would be your interpretation of this data? And so I'm really excited to invent that. So this is the beginning. Mapping the life course of adoption, as you saw, there's so many gaps. This is just a little mini step. And what I'm hoping in the design was to do a national survey first, just to get almost an epi-level data. Like, what extent are adoptees suffering from the typical chronic diseases, but the ones that we would predict would be higher among people with high ACEs, right? So what is it? We don't have a number. And that hopefully from there, we'll be able to move into new projects created with the community to begin to infiltrate and change the way we do adoption. So the other thing of a more critical paradigm on research knowledge building is that research is not objective. Research is a tool of power. And I wanted to use that tool of power to inform the adoptee groups that are largely volunteer, no money. They're just doing it to give them data points to say, this is how much those who are impacted by our groups are doing, and go get funding, from it, because I'll have a data point for it. So already ahead, I had some ideas of what I want to do. Similar to what Dr. Patton said, our child welfare system and our policies and practices are designed to get kids out of childhood, not to set them up for thriving adulthood. And what I'm hoping to do is understand what a thriving adulthood at 16 for an adopted person looks like, so that we can give that 5-year-old what she's going to need when she's 16. And we don't have that data though. And so that's one of my big objectives, is that as we're beginning to map out what we need later on in our lives as adopted people, we can go back and change the policies and laws so that young kids growing up will have what they need. I want to begin to bring some evidence around how adoptee-led groups and spaces actually are helpful. And maybe they're not going to be helpful. I mean, maybe that's very possible. But at least some information, because we know that community, we know that social isolation is hugely detrimental So I can't imagine, but we don't have much support around how adoptee-led groups and connections could help. And then again, I really want to create a new model for building research knowledge with adoptees so that the research is done with us and not to us. As an adoptee, I've completed lots of surveys and never knew what happened to them. And I'm committed not to have that happen. So for those who are geeky and want to know some of the relationships that I'm looking at, I'm really interested in cumulative stress, cumulative trauma. So I have a measure for adverse childhood experiences, also lifetime trauma, but adult stressful life. And then on top of that, racial discrimination, adoption microaggression, and birth parent loss. I'm really excited because the adoption microaggression scale is actually, Dr. Amanda Baden has written a phenomenal paper on adoption microaggressions. If you have not read it, I will make sure packets to you all. It is behind a paywall. And she actually is, since she was one of the researchers, she's developing a scale on adoption microaggressions. So you're actually helping her develop that scale by doing the survey too, so that we can begin to understand to what extent adoption discrimination is also stressful for adopted people. And then I think there's protective factors too. One of the thoughts I had was like, well, maybe people are really pro-social and join groups. And so that's why I ask, how pro-social you are. And then I'm interested in mental health, complex trauma, physical health especially, and then these various aspects of adoptive identity. So the survey was really long. It took 60 to 90 minutes. Some people finished it in 30. And I had people say, Holly, why couldn't you have split this into 2 different surveys? One that looked at all like mental health, physical health, that kind of thing, and then all of the adoptee groups. And I said, no, because I want to understand how that's experienced by one person, not separate it out. Because this looks like a small section, but this is really extensive. Because I had to pull back and realize we haven't cataloged what these adoptee group spaces actually are or what they do. So I had gone in thinking, oh, maybe adoptee groups are like mutual aid groups. And they only thinly align to that because they are typically volunteer and by people who have a shared lived experience. But then I realized there might be so much more going on in there. So I asked a lot of just simple questions like, what do you do? Why did you come to an adoptee group? What adoptee groups do you participate in? Because again, we don't even have that kind of map. So it was quite extensive, as you can see. Right. So this is where if you are an adopted person, or if you know an adopted person who might be willing to participate, I have kept this private link just for you all. You can do the QR code. I'll also give it to Pat to distribute. This is not to go out to the internet at all. I had the survey up on the internet since February. We had 6,000 respondents, but they were largely bots. Because as I looked at the data, they were done within 20 minutes, and there was just no way we could humanly do our survey in less than 30. And so really, unfortunately, we don't, I have to cull through all of that. So that's why I created a private link in the end of April to say, okay, I still want to get real adoptees to take the survey. So you can share this to an adopted friend, but don't put it out on social media because I can't get I just don't want the bots to come and get it. I do have compensation because I had the grant, so it's a $20 e-gift card, which I'm so thrilled to be able to pay people for their time and their knowledge. And I'm going to share just a little bit of some of the preliminary stuff. So we were trying to clean through the data through the end of March. So we had, just from the data there, we had about 350 people participate. The survey is for anyone who's adopted in the US, 18 and older. So you could be foster adopt, international adoption, or domestic adoption. And we have a nice proportion right now of those 3 types of adoption, which I think are kind of false silos, but I think there could be some differences. And again, as I said, I struggled a little bit to even define what is an adopted group, right? Because when I initially went in, I was thinking about the group that I had started and the other 501c3s that were around the country. But again, in 2020, everyone who had a physical group or organization was actually starting to be online. But online spaces are quite different as well. So that's why I ended up pulling back and I asked 3 ways to adoptees how they're connected to other adopted people. So one was, to what extent, from not at all, 0 to extremely 4, do you identify as being part of the adopted community? To what extent, 0 to 4, were you involved in the adopted community in the past, and then and currently? And what's interesting is that as we just looked at just the correlation data, there are differences between those kinds of responses. But what's clear is that those who say that they strongly identify as being part of the adoptee community, they are higher in their critical consciousness. So and it was interesting because John's session, or one person was sharing about, it was connecting with other adoptees that helped one person move out of the fog. It's kind of like there's so much about adoption you don't even know that you don't even know until you see a mirror of another adoptee telling your story. And so that's what community connection, I think, is giving people. And so the data is starting to show some of that. So that was just a little teaser. I think there will be so much more interesting things. We have all of the trauma histories. I think about Dr. Patton, and I'm like, gosh, maybe there'll be a data point on to what extent there has been child maltreatment, post-adoption. We just don't have a number for that. We don't know. We don't ask. So also you can stay connected. I made a website, care-research.org, if you're interested in collaborating in research, if you're interested in disseminating. That's the home. This is where I'll be sharing data findings out to the community. And so those are part of the next step. So I'll be presenting at the International Korean Adoptee Association gathering in July, some preliminary findings just on the nature of adoptee groups. And then Boston Korean Adoptees has a specific research adoptee program. And so they have some funding for it to get ASL translators, and that will be something that's open wide. And looking for other opportunities to, you could host a session. And I don't need to be the speaker. So I already talked to like Dr. Amanda Baden and Dr. Daeron Kim and Dr. Adam Kim. I said, you put some of these measures in here too, so you're gonna do the reporting out. So yeah. And that's all I have to say. In a nutshell. Yes.
Do you include problems with adoptees have with addiction in your ACEs, or is that included in your research, or is it included under mental health?
Yeah, I can't remember if we asked about substances. We do have a lot of adult stressful life events, and those are like, did you lose a job? Did you do things like that? So it might be captured there.
I think it was in there.
Yeah.
I think it was.
Yeah.
Good.
Yeah. So we have some variables. Nothing's extensive. This is such an epi level, but at least give us a data point. And what I'm excited too is, so we have, foster to adopt. So I can pull the data just from that group of people and just share, like foster adopt. This is how many, 80% experience this, 50% experience why. So we'll be able to do that kind of stuff if people want like specific group analyses.
Cool.
Yeah.
Yeah. So you were saying that you hope you get some data points that can be used for funding. How do you see that working?
Well, I think if we can say there is those adoptees who say they participate or they identify with the adopted community are doing better in their mental health. We can I don't know if there'll be even funders interested in this, but at least it would be something to write in a grant to say, hey, those who participate in groups like this feel like, 80% feel more empowered. but there's no data point like that right now. Like even the books that have been written about, at least of the Korean adoptee groups and associations, they don't give any, it's more descriptive of just kind of the history. But to show that there's actually a relationship, even though it has all the limits of cross-sectional data, is still something more than what we've had before. Yeah. Yes.
I just wanted to know, have you ever done like a focus group, just for, I know you're doing a survey. When you were saying participatory, I was thinking more about, going in depth. And having more information from the survey, or is it a mystery? I was thinking at the beginning, is it a method research?
Yeah, so I did focus groups before the survey with the adopted organizations to ask them, or especially around what do you think people get out of being part of your group? Because that's a failure of some research too, is that they actually don't include the outcome that's actually related to the intervention, right? And so then you're not going to see an effect because it's actually a variable that you didn't even measure. So I did have focus groups before, and the community partner groups also helped to do all the pilot testing. So they took the survey like 2 or 3 times to make sure that the language was appropriate for our community. This is actually, so people who take the survey can volunteer to participate in a qualitative interview afterwards. So it's a quant to qual. And because I know, like I like quant data because it gives us patterns, but the qualitative stuff gives us the stories. And so that's the purpose design of this. And so anyone who is willing, you can volunteer to participate in qualitative ones. What I wanted to do was look at the trends and then specifically ask people, I was thinking I would do some qualitative interviews with those who were 60 and older, maybe qualitative interviews with people who have high ACEs to kind of get some of their stories. And I'm actually in the process of talking to Dr. Jaron Kim, who's a qualitative researcher, on what it is that we're going to be asking qualitatively of the folks who volunteer to do that. Yeah. Yeah.
So going along with that, I have 2 questions. How long after taking the survey will you be doing the qualitative?
Yeah.
Roughly, like a rough approximation.
Mm-hmm.
And also, is there a plan to follow up with people a couple of years down the road to see, like, I would be curious to see how, if there was a 19-year-old person who took it today, how they would take the same survey 2 or 3 years down the road, and how I took it myself, as you know. So as a 55-year-old person, when I'm 58, 58, 59, however, what the difference is in my responses would be, because again, everything changes as we grow.
It totally changes as we grow. I wish I had that. So there will be no longitudinal follow-up. Now, I do ask people, like, did you do these gatherings or conferences, or did you, because in those conferences, there were measures done again. But I was thinking that at least this is 2009 was when we collected the adult adoptee data at the Donaldson Adoption Institute. It's almost 10 years later. So we're doing another cross-section. So again, hopefully we'll have a little sense. But yes, we need to do longitudinal research.
Yes, and thank you, because those words couldn't come to me.
Yeah.
My brain is not braining today.
And so my other passion is that, the first international adoptions in the modern way that we do them, came from the Korean War. And that generation are now in their 70s and their 80s. And I cannot believe that we don't have any data on them. And I feel like that's a crime, because these folks have been the grand guinea pigs of an experiment called international adoption, and that we don't know anything about their lives. I find really, really like what? So that's when I get a little bit on my high horse. So the cross-section data is maybe all that we can get on what that war generation has to share. And so actually that's the group that I've been pushing the most to. Please take the survey. Let's just get some data on how you are. And I know, quant data actually just flattens everyone out. No one's average, by the way. Everyone's on the other side. But quant gives us patterns, and patterns are powerful that we can then kind of, go and get money that can help us. Yeah.
I was very happy when you talked about, the researchers doing their research, it doesn't come out,
Yeah.
and then it's just on the shelves.
Yeah.
So how do you plan on, putting this information, especially for adoptees who wants to, not just, Koreans, but other
Yeah.
population who wants to follow your step,
Yeah.
how are you going to, make this available to?
I don't know. Come to me. How can I do that? How can we do that? Because it's not about me. Yeah, that's because I'm like, oh, social media is interesting and fascinating. But then I look at these TikTokers and I'm like, you are totally an expert in your lived experience. 100%. I give you that. However, there's a whole bunch of wisdom, other information that can actually help inform your one lived experience broader. And that's the information that I want to make more accessible. And so one of my dreams is, I know Dr. Hal Grodovan and Amanda Baden, they teach classes on adoption in their master psychology class. So I'm like, why can't we offer a class for adoptees? And isn't it funny? I'm like, a course for adoptees, life course, that kind of thing. Because I found that understanding some of these psychological models and theories of attachment and trauma helped to give me meaning. And I think that that's the thing that adoptees struggle the most for. How do I make meaning of this life that's been given to me? And so if those theoretical models could help me make meaning and understand my pathway, I think all adoptees can have those models, but only some can get that education. And that to me does not seem fair. And so this is this kind of democratization of knowledge and stuff. It's not one of ours, for somebody to hold it against us. It's for all of us to know and to think about, does that resonate with me? Is that how I would want to tell my story? Through a lens of attachment or through the lens of trauma? And maybe it's helpful in that one moment to get me out, right? I just think adoptees are much wiser, but they just don't have access to the language. Yeah.
Irish parents tell you why they took a little Korean girl?
Yes, they did. Yeah, I asked them. So my dad was a clinical psychologist. So I remember my dad or my brother saying, someone asked him, like, were you ever in therapy? He's like, yeah, my whole life. And what my dad told me was, so my mother had a hard time carrying her pregnancy. She almost lost my sister. But they wanted to expand their family. Being raised Catholic, they had always seen the little, give the money to the poor kids overseas in third world countries. So they had that, growing up. And then my dad said that he was actually doing some research with single and wed moms. And he realized, well, I already have biological children, so I don't need to have a white baby. And then he was also influenced by the zero population in the 70s. And so those are the things that influenced him, and my mom went along with it. And he really was the one who did all the labor. So he started that paperwork in 1968 or so. And again, it's that weird kismet of they wanted an older child, like a toddler, 2.5, 3. So when he started the paperwork, I was born. So that by the time he finished the paperwork, I was the exact age.
Wow.
So there's weird kismet, okay?
Wow.
And then I had tough conversations with them in my early 20s, and as I became racially more aware, and when I realized my own internalized racism toward other Asian people, I'm like, if I can be racist to the people who look like me, everyone is, right? We all prejudge. It's just our human nature, right? We just got to know and acknowledge that, and not continue to see everybody through that prejudgment and acknowledge it. And so I confronted my parents on that, and they started we adopted a kid. I'm like, oh, no. That's not absolve you. I'm not. But I can't tell you how difficult this second reckoning of Black Lives Matter has been on adopted adults. The greatest pain that I'm seeing over the last 3 years is adoptees saying, I can't go home because my parents are Trumpers. And they think that their love is colorblind, and they cannot see me, and they cannot see how the things that they're saying in alignment with Trump is hurting me. So I'm not going to go home. And there is so much pain right now because the parents are not willing to get into that space, and that's that older generation of adopted parents. My parents grew up in Pittsburgh. My mom said, I grew up, there was the black pool, there was the white pool. She, that was her childhood. And so I give them so much credit for being able to adopt across race. And they had, my grandmother was very racist. But again, it was an exceptional, except for me. But of course, I could feel it all around me growing up as a child. And similar to Dr. Patton, I didn't have any language for it. I remember my third grade teacher, she was white blonde, and I would, go to sit next to her, and she'd be like, no, you sit over there. And then the little blonde girl got to sit next to her. And I remember feeling it as a kid, like this rejection, right? I had no language for it. And then I happened to reconnect with a Korean American friend who was in the same classroom as me. And he was like, oh yeah, she was so racist. My parents were like, oh my God, she's so, and I was like, my parents would never know that because they're white. So they didn't experience her the way I ended up experiencing her. Or my friend who's also Korean American. So these are the things that when we don't give children language to name their experiences, then we don't know how to name them, but we're still experiencing them.
They must be so proud.
Yeah. I don't think they really get what I do. That's bottom line. And I'm kind of like, I'll educate you all. So my joy right now is seeing some of the, I'm looking at you, is seeing some of the mentees that were part of also known as this mentorship program, who are now in their 20s, Chinese adoptees, who are now on the board of also known as and leading kind of the next wave of community organizing. And to me, my generation, we started these things and efforts 27 years ago because we didn't have them out of lack. They had them and they still are saying this was important. So that to me is the evidence, not my experience, their experiences. They had those opportunities and they said, this helped me and we're going to continue to do it. And that to me is really powerful. How community connections and just having an ongoing kind of legacy is, yeah.
I was just wondering if you have any advice, because I work with kids that are in foster care. That's really my only connection to all of this. Any advice that I can tell the kids on my caseload regarding their identity? I hear that you're saying that possibly after the class, but my kids are in their teens, and I want them to at least hold on, until possibly being able to take a class on adoptees and stuff like that. But right now, they're sitting in a group home. I have no answers for them because I can't find one of their, I don't even know what it looks like. And they're running out of hope.
Yeah.
Any advice?
Yeah. So my advice is use imagination. So, and I think that, so I was trained clinically at Calvin Adolescent Mental Health, and adolescents are truth tellers, and they know grown-ups bullshit. And that's why adults don't like that, because teens will call you out. Right? And so I think there's nothing more powerful than honesty. To say to that young person, this hurts me that you don't know this. To have somebody say that and acknowledge it hurts, it's painful to feel like I don't have access and I don't even know how to access this information that is running in my body. So this has been a profound thing because again, I'm 51 now and I'm like, I'm still learning. And I think one of the most powerful things with my breast cancer is that it took me down to a 2.0 on the ways that my internalized narratives around rejection and loss and abandonment sat in my body. And how I rejected, because I didn't know what was out there, I rejected my own body. And that was maybe something that caused or created my body to get sick, because I never felt like I belonged in my own body. I started to make kimchi. And I'm kind of, again, I'm a very analytical person. So when I get a recipe, I'm like, 2 teaspoons, exactly. And my husband, he's also a Korean adoptee. He almost went to the CIA. He's like, what are you doing measuring salt? Like, it says 2 teaspoons, right? And so that's kind of how I'd always been. And I never thought that I could make Korean food at home. But after we lived in Korea for a 1.5 years while I was doing my dissertation, we came home and I said, okay, we got to make this food. And I think it was March of 2021. I'm making the kimchi and I found the recipe on the internet. And I realized, like, I just shifted and I opened my heart and I said, this is my food. This is my food. No matter how I make it, this is Korean. And even if it's a recipe on the internet, it's mine. And so realizing to tell that child, I know, you don't know what your father or mother looks like out there, but it is in you. And you can go in and visit them anytime. They might like that. But it is nurturing that inner child. And it's also recognizing that you don't know. And it's really hard not to know. And we could, try to imagine and draw out and, whatever those stories are. But it's better to have them out on paper than ghost haunting that child's psyche.
Yeah.
They are. BJ Lifton did some amazing work on the inner, the ghosts. I didn't get it as much when I was 24 because I just wasn't there. But now at 51, I'm like, oh my God, she knew what she was talking about. And we're all haunted. We're haunted by, all members of the adoption triad. That's essentially what BJ Lifton's work was, to say that, the adoptee were haunted by the child and the family that we didn't get to grow up in. They're the ghosts. The adoptive parent, are haunted by the biological child that they didn't get to have, or the lack of the biological connection to the child that they do have. The birth parent has the ghost of the child that they never got to raise. We're all haunted. And so we need to name the ghosts. We need to name those spirits. We need to lay them, to rest. I'll share I haven't shared this before. So I was in Korea for my dissertation. I got Fulbright funding to look at adolescents who are growing up in orphanages in South Korea. Because I said, all right, yes, I get it. Adoptees, we struggle. But how about the kids in the institutions? And in Korea, they have shamans that are called mudang. And I've always been fascinated. So there was a Fulbright scholar that was doing research on the mudang, which are the rituals. And I said, can you connect me to one? So I get connected. And the first thing that, of course, I'm like, I'm not going to tell you anything. See if you can, do something. But, can you really read my brain? And the mudang said, oh, if you stayed in Korea, you would have died when you were 13. And all of like my life energy just went out of me, because I don't think any adoptee ever thinks that they didn't have that life that they were removed from. And so I said to my husband afterwards, it was profound. And that was the first time I touched the ghost of my old self, that she had been walking with me always. And him saying that, just cast her into realization, but also allowed me to put her to rest. So I went to a Buddhist temple with my husband and I said, I have to let Hwayoung rest. She's dead. She's been dead a long time. And I got a candle and I wrote Yi Hwayoung, because that's my Korean birth name. And I lit that candle for her. And these are the kind of rituals that adoptees never get to have to grieve the person that they never were, but they were carrying on their back, feeling like they were supposed to.
Thank you for sharing.
Any person online? Oh, one chat.
Katie, is there anyone online with any questions?
There's our virtual book table.
Oh, that's us.
Oh, okay. Oh, no questions on
There's
this.
been- There was the survey and there was a comment about how much they enjoyed the presentation.
Okay.
I was thinking,
Yeah, happy to talk anything. Yes.
I was just gonna say, more comment how first of all, my daughter, Kentucky, filled out your, did this, participating in this research, but, I think even just filling out, doing that 60 or 90 minutes in itself is kind of a therapeutic intervention.
Yes.
Because how often do people with these lived experiences actually get the opportunity to have somebody really hear and ask them about all of these details? You go through life, I think, often fitting into the norm of biological families, and you don't have the thoughtfulness. I mean, when I looked at all those different factors that you're looking at, I found it incredibly touching. Sure.
Yeah, I appreciate that. And again, while some people complained how long it took, I got a lot of feedback from adoptees who said, thank you. No one has asked me. I've never had a place to actually put check a box, so thank you. I also wanted to say that the compensation is slow because I'm kind of I'm calling through. So everyone, I'm hoping will be compensated by the end of May. I just want to
My daughter did text me, ask her where my gift card is.
Yeah. It's coming. It's real. It's legit.
It's because I need a survey code.
A survey
Well,
code?
if you press, save for, save and come back later, it gives you the code before you actually. Okay. Yeah, and take a screenshot of that, but, I'm happy to.
Holly,
Yes.
I know that this is an internal code, but we can put that code within our private network, right?
Oh,
For people
yes,
in the community.
Yeah.
So I'll make sure that gets put into the workshop presentation
Yeah.
as well, so that everyone will have that there.
Yeah, so share it, email, but just don't get it on the internet.
don't
Do not put it on
public,
Twitter.
yeah.
Oh my God, when I put it on Twitter, it was when the boss got it. Yeah, and feel free to email me. So, and I think that's with it.
Yeah.
Yeah, if you have any glitch, because I can find you if you give me enough information.
And we'll have all of this on the workshop as well, because
Yeah.
Dr. McGinnis has shared it all with us also.
Yeah, the slides are all.
Mhm. I would just like to do a couple of moments of housekeeping too. Again, if anyone needs, if anyone is going to need a certificate of training hours, please do come and see me so you can sign this sheet. For any adopted people in the room, the coalition does offer support groups both for teenagers. And we also have once a month on the fourth Wednesday of the month, we have an adult adopted support group called Just Adoptees. Chester and I run that group together. And we recently changed the name because so many people had told us throughout our lives, like, oh, you're just adopted, oh, you're just adopted. So we renamed the group Just Adoptees because it's kind of like we're regaining a little bit of power by doing that. And then every other month, Dr. McGinnis, we would love to have you every other month. We have a support group called Professional Adoptees Networking, and it is for adopted people who work or volunteer within the realm of child welfare. So whether you are an activist, I will give you all of the. I'm sorry?
Where are you located?
We do it, it's all on Zoom. It's all on Zoom. I was getting to that part. Both groups are all virtual. So we have people, we have activists and people who work within child welfare for the professional end who have come from Minnesota, who have come from California. Because as far as we know, there is no other group for us, and it's a whole separate type of support.
Yeah.
So we do have all of those groups, yes.
What are the ages of the teenagers that you allow?
Kylie, what are the teen group ages?
Yeah, so we have a group for 10 to 14-year-olds and then 15 to right on the cusp of 18.
Of 18. Yeah,
And
and
those
they're,
are those, I should know this, but is it monthly or?
It is monthly
It's
on
monthly.
second Tuesday from 5 to 6:30 and then 6:30 to 7:30.
mhm. Yeah, and everything is, it's all laid out on our website. So if you go to affcny.org/RSVP, all of our groups will come up. There's parent support groups, there's parent professional support groups now, there's the adoptee professional support groups. So we do offer a lot out there for everyone. We're trying to really expand the horizons and get more into the adopted person realm as well. So join in anytime. The bulk of what we do is still on Zoom or Google Meets or something like that. So it's still, the bulk of it is still virtual because people really are responding
I
well
didn't
to it.
double check the QR code, so I hope it's working.
No, so it worked on my phone. I remember having a very specific.
Oh, okay. Happy to talk in.
But that's the red cap is the link. If you
Yeah,
type out
this is the link. If you
yeah.
type that, well, it's a little hard, but I'm hoping that.
And we'll get it all by Monday. Give us until Monday to make sure, but by Monday we can have all of this into the workshop. I'm a little obsessive, so I may get it.
I'll leave it open, the 8, 9, 10, a little wiggle.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.